Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, we got a lot of nice things to do today. Okay, so inshallah, we're going to be continuing بديع السماوات والأرض أنى يكون له ولد ولم تكن له صاحبة وخلق كل شيء وهو بكل شيء عليم. But let me tell you a couple things that we're going to be doing today. Yes, we're going to be doing the tafsir, but we're going to talk about a couple personalities, a couple figures that al-Qurtubi tells us about. Thought it would be a good idea to take some to take some time to actually learn about certain figures. I think we haven't done that in a while, and I thought it would be a good idea to get in a couple figures and learn about them. Okay, so let's see with بديع السماوات والأرض, we talked about بديع, and we said بديع actually means the one that is precise in creating something, and plus the one that gives it beauty. Okay, so we looked at that piece of it. And أَنَّى يَكُونُ لَهُ وَلَدٌ وَلَمْ تَكُنْ لَهُ صَاحِبَةٌ. So we said that if we were to go in these ayat, it kind of looks like La ilaha illallah somehow, because this one is negating that there's any partner to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether we're speaking about jinn or whether we're speaking about, begotten anything, whether male, female, and basically made it clear, subhana, that there's nothing like unto the Lord Almighty. When you say subhana, that actually would emphasize that there's nothing like to compare to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing like unto Allah wa ta'ala, meaning that he is beyond all, and that the Lord Almighty is basically superseding all. So if you have any good quality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically be the ultimate one with this good quality. He would be superior to all. And of course, when we say وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى, that only the good names are to be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's not any description that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one to be in the highest level of it, but only the good descriptions alone. Okay. And we also said, so this would be actually like La ilaha and then illallah, and here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is بديع السماوات والأرض أنى يكون له ولد ولم تكن له صاحبة وخلق كل شيء وهو بكل شيء عليم. And we talked about the emphasis, the most important emphasis, and I always like to relate when we speak about Tawheed, especially trying to understand Tawheed. I always like to connect it and relate it with ayat al-Kursi. That's the most important ayah in explaining Tawheed. You explain ayat al-Kursi, you explain everything about Tawheed. We had done that a couple times, so I don't want to do it again, but I want you to see the relationship between ayat al-Kursi and also these ayat, where it's coming in with the same idea. So if you were to look at Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-Hayy, notice that here, khalaqa. All right, so the emphasis on what makes God, what makes the deity, what makes the creator, what makes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Allah, meaning the Lord Almighty, the God. What makes him being the God is number one, he is al-Hayy, he is al-Qayyum, or he is the one that basically is the one that is eternal, the one that is self-efficient. In other words, all the other things are basically creatures. So he would, if we say he is al-Hayy al-Qayyum, well, that would actually mean that he is the creator, because everything else is a creature. So you could see the relationship right here coming in with the same concept and telling us that everything else is considered makhluqa. Everything else is considered that it was created, and therefore the Lord Almighty is the creator. At the same time, it comes in to emphasize al-ilm, just like in Ayat al-Kursi, الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم. Of course, to tell us that there's not even any slight bit or even a small amount or any stage of an early stage of being tired or being dependent on others, etc. لا تأخذه سنة ولا نوم له ما في السماوات وما في الأرض. Well, that is to basically reflect علم. When you say له ما في السماوات والأرض وما في الأرض, that's ownership. من ذا الذي يشفع عنده إلا بإذنه يعلم. Here's that one. يعلم ما بين أيديهم. Also emphasizing علم, emphasizing knowledge. What is emphasizing knowledge and ilm supposed to mean? It is supposed to reflect encompassment, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with his ilm يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم. ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم, speaking about whether we're speaking about place or whether we're speaking about time. يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم, speaking about place or time, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses all. يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم. Continue the ayah. Now I can't believe I forgot it. يعلم ما بين أيديهم وما خلفهم. ولا يحيطون بشيء. Here we go. ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه. Again, emphasizing that إحاطة or that encompassment, which is actually right there, giving us that encompassment right there. لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. That encompassment, لا تدركه الأبصار, is basically tell us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all. Okay, so ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض. وسع كرسيه السماوات والأرض, to also emphasize that his greatness, that his magnificence is basically in control over everything, that he is al-Latif. What is al-Latif? Al-Latif means subtle. Subtle means something that is happening. There's a certain force, but you don't even realize where that force, where that momentum is coming from. So that's al-Latif and al-Khabir. Now, there's another piece, which is when you read Ayat al-Kursi, I missed on it, which basically reflects this part of it, that مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. So that would basically emphasize the word فَعْبُدُوهُ, to worship the Lord Almighty, and that مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَعُ عِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ is because وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَكِيلٌ, for he is basically the one that is responsible, in control. Basically, everything depends on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so you could see the relationship always with Tawheed and understanding Tawheed, that there's always, I would say the center would be, to understand all of this would be two ayat, which I always relate to when speaking about Tawheed. The ayat فاطر السماوات والأرض جعل لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا ومن الأنعام أزواجا in Surah Al-Shura, and also ayat al-Kursi. You have these two ayat understood, you got Tawheed understood entirely. These two ayat. فاطر السماوات والأرض جعل لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا ومن الأنعام أزواجا ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير. And then له مقاليد السماوات والأرض. And then, of course, those ayat, those 2-3 ayat in Surah Al-Shura, and also in Ayat al-Kursi, you got that. And that's the same thing you would see. That would be a blueprint for it. Okay, let's see. أَنَّا يَكُونُ لَهُ وَلَدٌ, and we talked about أَنَّا يَكُونُ لَهُ وَلَدٌ. This isn't an interrogative clause, but this is actually more of an exclamation, telling you, well, how's that even possible? This is telling you that this is not something that is at all even logical. Not even logical. Why not? Because it's impossible for the creature to be a creator, because it's impossible for the creature to be a creator, because it would basically contradict the actual word. A creator actually means that he is the one to make things exist. So how is it that he can be the one to be one existent by the effort of others, at the same time be the creator. So in other words, it's an oxymoron. It's contradictory that it would at all be possible. Okay. ولم تكن له صاحبة وخلق كل شيء. خلق كل شيء, created everything. وهو بكل شيء عليم. So خلق كل شيء, basically كل شيء basically tells us that it is general to include everything. Everything that was created basically falls under the power of the Lord Almighty. ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ. That is your Lord. When you say the word Allah, it's different than the word Rabb, because Allah comes from two words, al-ilah, and then they're blended together. Let's write that down, right? I think we did this one before, but we're still going to do it again. Okay, let's see. So it comes with two things, the word al, which basically is the identifying article, and ilah. Okay, you put them together. Let's take this, the space in between, and oops, okay, what happened? Okay, here we go. Basically put the space in between the wrong place. Hold on, here we go. You take this one, al-ilah, and you basically, what did I do? Sorry, with the space, with the laptop, it's kind of Allah. Okay, here we go. Al-ilah. So they basically took out the I in ilah to basically say Allah is basically al-ilah. Okay. So al-ilah, or the word Allah. The word Allah was also used by even non-Muslims. So even the different religions, they would also, whether it's Elohim in a Semitic language, basically in Hebrew, Elohim, or Allah, Aloha, or Allah, whether you use the word Allah, or whether you would use deity, or whether you would use God, that's also okay to use. It doesn't have to be just Allah. But the word Allah cannot be put into a plural, because it in itself is actually containing Allah, the God, and you cannot make it into feminine. It doesn't have a gender. Okay, Allah, the God. So how's that different than Rabb? The word Rabb basically means the one to take care of things. She said, I heard a sister say about al-ilah, the Allah, which is wrong and right. What? The ilah? The ilah? Well, no, the ilah.
Translated that al-ta'rif, Allah, the Allah.
No,
it's
like not the Allah, it's the God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Allah means the God and not the Allah. Okay, because the is within the word Allah. Within the word Allah. Okay, that's al right there. So it's not the Allah, it's actually the God. Okay, that's what Allah means. Okay, Rabbukum, Rabb is different because it relates to one that cherishes, one that is a Lord, one that takes care of you, etc. That's a Rabb. So that's why even the husband would be Rabb al-Usra. He would be Rabb al-Usra, and it's not haram to call him Rabb al-Usra because the word Rabb means to cherish. Okay, so if he's the one that's cherishing, he's the breadwinner, etc., that would be Rabb al-Usra. Okay, but of course, Ar-Rabb is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's the Ar-Rabb. Okay, he is Ar-Rabb. Okay, let's see. ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ. That's to emphasize right there that is the God and also the Lord. Okay, La ilaha illahu, that there's no God worthy of worship but him. Wait a minute. So why did you say worthy of worship? Because the word ilah also contains not only, when you look at the word ilah, what does God mean? Where does that whole concept and the whole idea of God come from? It's not made up. The whole concept of God is part of the revelation. People didn't make the idea of God. No, the whole idea of God in itself was actually revealed and not made up. Okay, this is important to keep in mind. Why? Because the whole idea of God, where did humanity come with the idea that there is a God? That in itself was actually sent through the prophets and messengers. That idea itself. So we didn't invent the idea of God, but the whole concept of God was actually part of the revelation. So all people basically have it within their fitrah, within their instinct. What is an instinct? An instinct is basically something that is, let's say, manufactured within you, that is created within you. That's what an instinct is. It's part of your DNA. And we know, of course, right now they'll tell you, is there a God gene? Right now, all they know is that there is something that is making others or certain people probably more connected with searching about God and all of that. That's what they know. But it's not that there is a specific God gene, but we would know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there is part of your blueprint as a human being. Part of your blueprint is that you are always in search of, why was I created? Okay, so that's part of your manufacture. Why was I created? What is the purpose of life? All of that. And then part of you is recognizing that there's a superpower out there. Is it God? You just recognize there's a superpower, there's something to depend on, that I can reach out in help, in dua, in support, etc. Then, of course, then the word ilah is basically something that even before Islam, they had that idea, that at least that instinct, that idea, that whether it came from the time of Prophet Ibrahim or whether from other religions, but it was there even in other countries, everywhere, all over the world, you would always see that the idea of religion was always live. Whether they would build temples for it, or whether they would have small or big, even small or big, or whatever it is in terms of things to worship, etc. So that's that area of worship. Okay, so when you look at their ilah, so they would say, for example, that whatever this idol, or whether they're putting in a puja or for their God or whatever it is, what is the whole idea of God? The idea of God means something that someone would relate to in worship, relate to in seeking help, relate to in believing that it has the power to give life, the power to make death, the power to cherish, the power to heal, the power to give you just different things. But of course, for other religions, they could relate to certain figures or certain things, that this is what has that power. For a Muslim, that Allah is the one that we would turn to in worship, in ritual, in submission, in faith, in believing that He's the first of the force that has all the power, is basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so now the difference between ilah, Allah, and Rabb. Okay, so Allah, the God, the ilah, the one that is to be worshipped, the one that is that is the God, or the one that we turn to in worship, in ritual, in seeking support. Okay, Rabb is the one to cherish, the one to be consistent in giving you that cherishment. So when you say La ilaha illahu, the Arab themselves did believe in God. They believed in God, and that's why they said, أَجَعَلَ الْآلِهَةَ إِلَهًا وَاحِدًا. They said, how can it be? How can He make all those gods into one God? Are we going to eliminate the rest? So they considered that is denying all the other gods. And they considered that was going to be absurd, considered that was going to be absurd. But then they didn't realize that what's absurd is that you believe in the existence of God, yet you go worship gods, or you would worship multiple things that you would consider are inspiring you to believing in God. Okay. ذلكم الله ربكم. And of course, certainly, they believed in God, and certainly they would turn to the idols as representatives of gods. That's what they considered. They considered that those were representatives of God, and therefore, that's why in Surah Al-Zumar, they were basically saying, ما نعبدهم وما نعبدهم إلا ليقربونا إلى الله زلفى. What did they want to object on? They wanted to object when the Quran was coming in to debate them on how can you say and believe in God, but then go worship something else. So they said, well, it doesn't mean that this is contradictory. How not? They said, well, this is just a representative of God, because the Quran was coming in to say, well, since that's what you're worshiping, then is that capable of giving life? Is that capable of making death? Is that capable of giving, life to itself even? If it's not capable of giving life to itself or life to others, or even support or help itself, then there's no way that it can help or support you. In other words, it cannot be a Rabb, and it cannot be a God. Therefore, it should not be worshipped. Okay? That was the whole argument that Islam was laying out. It should not be worshipped. Islam's argument is that if it is God, then it should also be a Rabb. It should also be the one to provide you, should always be the one that you would turn to for help, and therefore it should be the one that you would worship. Okay, I want you to look at these three things. When you look at ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ, again, let's do this again. I'm going to break it down again. Okay, Islam tells them, well, if he is the one that is the God, meaning the one that you would consider as the creator, the one that you would consider as the one to continue always cherishing you, to give you provision, to give you life, to give you death, etc., then he should be the one that you would worship. So the word ilah is more related to worship. Okay. But of course, the pagan Arabs, they considered that was not contradictory, because they considered, well, your argument fails, according to them. Your argument fails because we don't regard what we worship as necessarily Allah. That was their argument. Their argument was, we don't regard what we worship, our ilah, as necessarily God, because we worship these idols as a representation on behalf of God and not God himself. They were making the argument that we believe that God, the one Allah, that yes, certainly he created everything, etc. That's a completely different thing. Just because he created it doesn't mean I'm going to go worship him directly. So I'm going to be worshiping something that represents God. So Islam comes in and says, well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense, because technically you would be worshiping that and not necessarily God. You made up your own concept and made up a narrative and said, well, this is just to represent it. This is just to inspire us of God. But you are the one that made it. You put this representation yourself. You were not given any credible resource to claim that this makes a fair representation of God, when God himself did not tell you to make this representation in any shape or form. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ. That is the God, that is the one that cherishes you, and that is the one that you should be worshiping. That's the problem when you look at when people translate, there's no God but God. That's an absolutely wrong statement. In fact, that when somebody says there's no God but God, that is a self-contradictory statement. That's a self-contradictory statement. but there's no God worthy of worship but Allah, but God Almighty. So what is that supposed to mean? That's basically believing that God Almighty is the creator, and therefore my worship / my dedication, my submission, the legislation, my definition of right and wrong basically goes to the Lord Almighty Allah. And certainly when you look at the definition of ubudiyya, I want you to look at this one. What is al-ubudiyya? Al-ubudiyya basically means submission, basically means servitude. Okay. When you look at that piece of it, al-ubudiyya, we usually think of it as really just an issue of ritual. But Islam is always emphasizing that no, it's way more than ritual, because it encompasses a number of different pieces. When one is legislation, two is basically what you would dedicate your life for. And this is important. What are you dedicating your life for? Your basically your intention behind whatever you're doing. What is that dedicated for? And number two, your behavior. Who's defining what's right and what's wrong? The definition of ethics, morality, all of that. Who's the one that's defining all of that? And that's basically Allah Almighty. So then, of course, ذَلِكُمُ اللَّهُ رَبُّكُمْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ خَالِقُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ. Since He is the creator of everything, then you would basically turn to Him in seeking one, al-ibadah, وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَكِيلٌ, and He's also the one that basically everything depends on. Okay, let's see. خالق كل شيء, and he said, okay, لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار. لا تدركه. Now, one thing al-Qurtubi, I loved how he emphasized this one. Let's see, he said, الإدراك بمعنى الإحاطة والتحديد كما تدرك سائر المخلوقات والرؤية ثابتة. Okay, what does that mean? And لا تدركه الأبصار. He said, منزه عن سمات الحدوث. What does that mean? Now, one thing you would want to keep in mind is al-Qurtubi is Ash'ari, but what does that mean? I don't want to go in the details of what that means and all of those debates about Ash'ari and Maturidi and all of those different things and Mu'tazili and all of that. But I would like to say that right now, and especially, before it was worse, right now, not many people necessarily go into that debate. They do exist. You've got, in fact, you'll have right now, that for the guy, and certain countries will actually consider that, yeah, we're at war with the Wahhabis or Ahl al-Hadith or whatever it is, and the Ahl al-Hadith will do really the same battle, by the way. So it's not only a Shia, but it's also Ahl al-Hadith. They'll also target the other, and literally, instead of considering each other as mubtadi'ah, they'll literally do something similar to what ISIS does. It's really negate the other entirely. It's quite sad that the Ummah had forgotten that a lot of those contributed in the ilm that we have today. So even if you were to look at Wahhabi, Salafi, whatever you want to label that as, or Ahl al-Hadith, that's what they prefer naming themselves. Okay, you see, unfortunately, sometimes also negating that people like in Nawawi were even ulama, or even forgetting that they themselves were Ash'ari. So we have great scholars that were Ash'ari, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, al-Haythami. We have great scholars that were Ash'ari, and we also have great scholars that were Ahl al-Hadith, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and of course, you talk about a number of different scholars that were, I would say, the pioneers to bring about the ilm that we have today. But I don't want to go in details with that, but I want to look at some of the things that, whether you're talking about Ash'ari or whether you're talking about Maturidi, Ahlul Hadith, or even Mu'tazili, they'll also, they'll agree on a number of, in fact, they'll agree on, I would say, the basis of Tawheed, or the basis of religion, but sometimes there would be the debate in how you word things and not necessarily what you believe in. And that's why I don't like getting into that debate. Sometimes they get into the debate of wording and it becomes a futile debate. I don't want to get into that, like I said. Okay, let's see. He said, لا تدركه الأبصار, that this is indicating that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically beyond what would be considered as a creature. So he did not happen, but he basically is there. Al-Hayy al-Qayyum. He was always there, and therefore he was not part of something happening, therefore a process, but the Lord Almighty is Al-Hayy al-Qayyum. He is basically the eternal one and did not start at one point there, he became a God, but he was always munazzahun anil hudud. He was always beyond being made, beyond all, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is eternal. He is self-efficient, does not depend on others. Okay, the other thing is لا تدركه الأبصار. الإدراك بمعنى الإحاطة والتحديد. الإحاطة والتحديد. I want you to look at this one. What is الإحاطة? الإحاطة basically means encompassment. What is encompassment? That you go beyond all its borders. No borders that would basically consider as that border that determines your place, or the end of your place of power, or the end of your place of knowledge, the end of it. So there is no end to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge. There is no limit. There is no border to how much Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encompasses everything. But there's a border to you. Your sight. There's a certain amount of distance that you're capable of seeing. Then after that, it becomes completely blank. There's a certain amount of how much in a certain decibel that you're capable of hearing, and then at one point you can't hear it. It just becomes something that your brain is not comprehending. And of course, whether we're speaking about low sound or whether we're speaking about high pitch or even a high sound, same thing. We're talking about distance. We're talking about the seeing. There's whether we're speaking about something small, and that's why we would use a magnifying glass, or basically just different magnifiers, or whether we're speaking about how big. So in other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether small, big, distant, close, or whether we're speaking about sound, low, high, all of that, whatever it is, we're speaking about maybe the amount of something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all that, and there's not a limit. There's no limit, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala الإحاطة ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه. So when you say لا تدركه الأبصار, is this talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala they're not capable of seeing? Or is this talking about that we're not capable of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or what really is it? So number one is that this basically, he says الرؤية ثابتة, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one, we're looking at وهو يدرك الأبصار, that he is beyond all what people see. Okay, so number one, you're talking about, this is proving, just as in Surah Al-Shura, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said وهو السميع البصير, ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير. There's nothing like unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but at the same time, It didn't just negate everything about Allah, but it said, وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, and affirmed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as-sami', is all hearing and all seeing. As-sami' al-basir. Okay, what is that also supposed to mean? وَهُوَ يُدْرِكُ الْأَبْصَارِ, that he is seeing all, and he is basically aware and encompassing all capabilities, all the potentials, whether the potentials to see or whether the potential to do something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that encompasses all of those potentials, and that nothing goes beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. Keep that one in mind. Nothing goes beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. So when we speak about qadar, you made the choice to, I don't know, carry this bottle. Okay? When you made the choice to carry the bottle, your will to carry the bottle basically happens by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because your power to move your nerves, to move your hand, to see things, that was all given to you by Allah anyways. So your will, when you will something, that does not go beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, meaning beyond his power. Because he's the one that gave you the will, the power to see, the power to move, the power to hear, the power to comprehend, all of that. It doesn't go beyond Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, these things that you might see as matter, they don't function on their own, but they function by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, meaning by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so when we talk about it-tahdid as well, what is it-tahdid? It-tahdid means to be precise and basically have an accurate precision basically of something. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about whether location or whether power or whatever requires a certain precise amount or precise distance, or what precise anything that is precise in whatever dimension is basically determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, number one. Number two, that nothing goes beyond the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number three is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically the one to go beyond that all. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was the one that is precise, that is accurate in everything, and that is also encompassing everything. So here's the other thing. Are we going to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day? So when you say لا تدركه الأبصار, our sight is not capable of understanding. What? Why tudrik? Why not? Why didn't it say there's no way that we could see Allah? But why لا تدركه? Tudrik means to be precise in something, have an accurate understanding of something. Okay, so that's an idrak. An idrak is to comprehend, to understand, etc. But it said, لا تدركه الأبصار. Your sight is not capable of encompassing Allah, understanding Allah. What does that mean? No, you're capable of comprehending Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power, that, to a certain level, you're able to understand it. Yes, he created the skies, he created the earth, he created, 1, 2, 3. You're capable of processing that. But when it comes to, are you capable of seeing Allah? So that's that question. And of course, al-Qurtubi, he said, we have the evidence that the Prophet ﷺ was going to see Allah on Judgment Day. He said there are authentic evidences on that. And there's that debate. Let me just break down that debate for you for a bit. Okay, what is that debate? The debate is between, again, kind of like what we were saying before in regards to understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that debate, and just keeping that one in mind. How do we understand seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that debate is basically between al-Asha'ira and Ahl al-Hadith. We were talking about them earlier. And let me just break it down. Okay, I'm going to break it down for a bit. Okay, let's say majority of the scholars, they basically said we cannot see Allah. Okay, I'm going to give it to you right there. I'm going to put it for you in a note so you could actually see what we're doing. Okay, and looking at those notes so you could get at least, something visual. Hold on, I'm going to give you something visual so you could actually see it. And that way, okay, let's see right there. Right there. Okay, so I'm gonna, okay, and here we go. I'm gonna share this screen with you. Okay, let's look at this one. So majority of the scholars, okay, they said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot be seen with our naked eye. Whether we're speaking about a prophet or whether we're speaking about pious people, that it's impossible, that's the majority of the scholars, it's impossible for us to visualize or even see Allah. Whether we're speaking about prophets or whether we're speaking about non-prophets, even saints or salihin or whatever. What's the evidence? They said, well, Musa alayhi salam, when he had asked to see Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Lan tarani," you will not be capable of seeing me, meaning in dunya. Okay. And in another evidence, they said in the hadith that was narrated by Muslim, that when the Prophet ﷺ was asked, "Hal ra'ayta rabbuk," did you see your Lord? And he said, "Nurun anna arah," I just see light. How am I going to be capable of seeing him? Okay, let's see. Sayyidah Aisha, also this hadith, we're going to get in details with this hadith because this is an important hadith. Okay, she had quote said, "Man za'ama anna Muhammadan ra'a rabbahu faqad a'zama 'ala Allahi firya." That was pretty straightforward. She said, whoever claimed that Muhammad had seen his Lord had made a magnificent blasphemy upon Allah. Okay, so this group of scholars, they said it is impossible to see Allah, but the only thing that can happen is basically on Judgment Day for the believers, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had literally said in regards to Surah al-Qiyamah, and on Yawm al-Qiyamah, وُجُوهِ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٍ إِلَىٰ رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٍ. Straightforward, that on Judgment Day, there would be faces that would be enlightened and that would be basically bright and happy, and they would be looking at their Lord Almighty. Now, according to those scholars, they said it is impossible because another logical reason that they said it is impossible for us to see Allah because Allah is basically something that is eternal. But you basically have a limit to your life. And the Lord Almighty's magnificence is beyond your ability to comprehend, your ability to see. And another evidence, they said, when in Surah Taha, Prophet Musa alayhi salam asked to see Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, if you are capable of seeing the mountain, then you're going to be capable of seeing me. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he appeared, خَرَّ مُوسَى صَعِقًا. Musa خَرَّ صَعِقًا, meaning he basically went in a complete coma. He wasn't capable of seeing because he was in the body that has limits. A human body in this life has limits to the amount of what it can comprehend, what it can see, what it can, all of that. And certainly, خَرَّ مُوسَى صَعِقًا. That's the first opinion. The second opinion basically is not many scholars had said that, but some scholars actually said that it is possible that only prophets would be seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's basically what Ibn Abbas, in some of the opinions that he had said, and also Imam Ahmad, they said the Prophet ﷺ, النبي رأى ربه بفؤاده لا بعينه. They said the Prophet ﷺ had seen the Lord Almighty with his heart and not with his eye. So that's kind of, I would say, if you're saying رأى بقلبه not بعينه, I would say it's really believing in the first one, because if you say he didn't see him with his eyes, then you really are saying that it's impossible to see with the eyes. But they sometimes would use these different wordings, even though, like I said before, sometimes it's like a futile conversation because they're just wanting to word it in a certain way, but really on ground, you're really meaning the same thing. So the second opinion, whether it's Ibn Abbas or Ubay, okay, they said, yeah, it is possible, but they would see Allah with their heart and not with their eye. What does that look like? What does that even mean? Okay, and they said that would not be something that any salih would be capable of doing. But seeing in this life, they said it's impossible that. So they're coming in with the same idea, really, with the previous scholars, and they said it's impossible. Let's see. For the third opinion that said that this is possible, there was actually coming from some of the Sufi sects. The Sufi sects, like Ibn Ata and Junaid and other Sufis, they basically, Al-Ahnaf ibn Qais, they were saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals himself to the awliya. Who are al-awliya? Al-awliya is the plural of wali. What is al-wali? Al-wali is the one that dedicates himself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, they are so dedicated to Allah in their worship, in their submission, in the way that they would relate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it's so strong that they barely make any sin, whether major or minor sin. They are awliya, they're like saints, okay? So they said, at least Ibn Ata, Junaid, and of course Secondary, and all of those, they said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala appears to the saints in dreams, or fi halil mukashafat, or certain appearances that are more of miraculous appearances. But they never said that it was with the naked eye, but it was more of a representation to basically get a feeling inside the heart. In other words, it's an inspiration and not necessarily an actual seeing that you could see. And that's why you would say Ibn Taymiyyah, Nawawi, Ibn Hajar, they basically said, in response to that, they said, and what the Salihin would say in seeing God in dreams, that's not considered as an actual seeing, but that's more of a symbolic thing, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's nothing like unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whatever, in other words, they were saying, well, whatever you had seen in a dream, that you probably dreamt of God, and that, yeah, I had seen God in a dream, etc. Well, that's more of a metaphor and not necessarily the actual presentation of Allah. They said because a dream is not an actual relationship. It's more of something that is happening basically in your mind and not really a physical thing. Okay. So just to keep that, so we've got the first opinion basically said that it happens, well, number one is that something that people are seeing in this dunya, all had said that, no, it's impossible to see God in this life. Okay, whether prophet or non-prophet. That's the first opinion. The second one, they said, well, to see God in a dream, that's more of a metaphorical or at least a symbolic representation and not the actual thing. As for seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was it at all possible that the Prophet himself had seen Allah? That's that other debate that we're going to get to, at least in some details. Okay, so when we say لا تدركه الأبصار, meaning that no eye is capable of encompassing. Because if you're seeing something, okay, what does to see something really mean? To see something means you recognize a dimension, you recognize a distance, you recognize a body of something. That's what it means to see. Because that's what your eye was designed to basically understand in process, and basically in order to see something, it reflects the light for you to see the border of something. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is borderless, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not within border, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond border. How does that even happen? How is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond border? Because to say something has a border actually means to say something has a body. Okay? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's called it tajseem. And that's that debate as well between the Ash'ari and Ahl al-Hadith, is when you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is everywhere, what do you mean? Well, according to Ash'ari, they're like, well, what we mean is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is borderless. He's everywhere. For Ahl al-Hadith, they consider that that's completely wrong to say, because to say Allah is everywhere, that would actually mean, by definition, Allah's included in everything. He's part of the chair, he's part of the tree, he's part of the skies, he's part of the sun. That's basically right there making as the main foundation for all the different religions, and how they said that God can be a part of something. So al-Hadith would completely reject that, and they would say, well, that's a dangerous thing to say. Okay. Now, the other thing is that if you would say, for example, for defining, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically said, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. Should we understand Yadullahi fawqa aydihim? Should we understand that, yes, there's something called hand for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore there's a border within that hand to make, and then Ahl al-Hadith would basically get so offended by that, and they would say, well, wait a minute, that's tajseem. You just made a border, and right there had defined that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a certain border, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala la tudrikuhu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have a border. There is no border for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. La tudrikuhu al-absar, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all. So what is the best stance that we could do right here? I mean, these are great scholars and those are great scholars. I personally like to stick to the interpretation of Ahl al-Hadith in this regards, and not the Ash'ari. Sorry, Ash'ari, you're great scholars, but with this one, I prefer staying with Ahl al-Hadith in regards to understanding Allah Almighty, because the second that we try to put in metaphorical explanations and say, well, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim, we can't use it's a hand, and we'll just have to somehow give it a metaphorical presentation and say this is referring to power and not hand. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Yadullah. I'll just stick to the wording that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had used, and I wouldn't give it a metaphorical interpretation, because the second that you would put in a metaphorical interpretation for something that can be understood ala al-haqiqa, to put in a metaphorical or figurative explanation on something that can be understood to a certain extent, of course, as literal interpretation, or literally what it's saying. It's Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. I'm just going to leave it at that. Okay, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is limited within a certain border. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond borders. La tudrikuhu al-absar. Because the whole idea of sight and what sight is capable of doing is understanding borders. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like unto Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wa huwa as-sami'u al-basir. And he's the all-seeing, all-hearing. In other words, do not negate that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as an entity, that he is basically capable of doing different things as sama, as hearing, as seeing, as controlling, as pushing, as bringing something, etc. That's basically Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why he said, lahu maqalidu samawati wal ard. What is lahu maqalidu samawati wal ard? So we're talking about the entity that laysa kamithlihi shay. But lahu maqalidu samawati wal ard, even the function and the force and how things actually go and come or basically the forces that make things in the world around us is lahu maqalidu samawati wal ard. It basically is controlled by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now when you say la tudrikuhu al-absar, does this also mean and give me the inference that, well, your naked eye is not capable of seeing Allah, but is my vision within my heart capable of seeing Allah? What does that even look like? Is that even, how do we understand all of this? I mean, your eye, you may, for example, I would tell you about a plant, okay, a tree, and I would tell you, well, it has a trunk and it has these leaves and all these little twigs and all of that, and there's a fruit. You right now can't see it, okay? You don't see a tree in front of you, but in your heart, you recognize, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Are you right now seeing a tree? No, you're not seeing a tree. But in your heart, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You know the description. If I were to tell you, a figure that you probably know, this scholar or that scholar, and you're like, yeah, I know what they look like. You may, if you're an artist, you probably can be even, you can probably just on the top of your head, just draw them, even though you can't, you can't see an actual picture. These are really great artists, and then they're capable of drawing them because they could really visualize all the different details of those borders. That's actually, I consider that as extremely smart. I can't draw stickmen. Those stickmans, those hangman people. Yeah, I can't even draw that. I'm so horrible at art, let alone draw or even go in details with those kind of arts. Okay, so when you say لا تدركه أبصار القلوب, does that mean that even the hearts cannot imagine what it means when we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laysa kamithlihi shay? It's impossible for our hearts to visualize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would look like because he's beyond your imagination. So it's not just beyond your vision, but it's also beyond your imagination. And then he said, لا تدركه العقول فتتوهمه, that even your mind cannot be visual and cannot visualize what God would look like and what God is. Yes, you recognize Yadullah, so you say, okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a hand, but guess what? You would call the doorknob a handle, and you would call your hand a handle, or a hand, okay? And you would also call perhaps maybe a cat's hand a hand, okay? But that doesn't mean that you consider the cat or your hand or the doorknob's hand. You wouldn't consider that they all have hands. You wouldn't consider that it's the same hand. You would consider that they all have hands. The doorknob's handle basically is certainly a handle, but that doesn't look like your hand. Okay. At the end is that just because there's the word hand, or there's the word in the hadith, for example, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would stomp on Jahannam. What does that even look like? We just say we don't really know. لا تدركه الأبصار. So we can't visualize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not in our vision with our sight, and not in our hearts, and not in our brain. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ليس كمثله شيء. Okay, let's get into this one. So when we say, let's say the other one, he said, and it was said, المعنى لا تدركه الأبصار المخلوقة في الدنيا لكنه يخلق لمن يريد كرامته بصرا وإدراكا يراه به كمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. That's a very strong statement. إذ رؤيته تعالى في الدنيا جائزة عقلا. إذ لو لم تكن جائزة لكان سؤال موسى مستحيلا ومحال أن يجهل نبي ما يجوز على الله وما لا يجوز بل لم يسأل إلا جائزا غير مستحيل. This is profound. Let me explain what this is saying. I'm going to first interpret it, word by word. She said, and that means that the sight, in other words, the naked eye, is not capable of comprehending it in this life. In other words, the sight that is created in this life. But he may create to whomever he wills a miracle, a miraculous sight, basically, in the ability to comprehend and see as Muhammad ﷺ had seen Allah. For seeing Allah is possible that is logically. If that was not possible logically, then Prophet Musa alayhi salam's request to see Allah would have been impossible. And it would be impossible that a prophet of Allah would be ignorant of what would be possible and impossible on Allah. But he had asked for something that is possible and not impossible. It's quite interesting. I mean, pretty profound, that Prophet Musa alayhi salam, it's not that he asked for something that is impossible, but he asked for something that is possible. So if he asked for something that is possible, then the ones to respond to this, they would say, well, فَخَرَّ مُوسَى صَعِقًا. The Prophet Musa alayhi salam, he basically had went into a saq, kind of like a coma. So he didn't recognize the limitations of his own body and what he's capable of seeing and not seeing. So did he really not know what is possible and not possible? I'm just saying, let me look at this. Number one, he said ash-shifa. So that's basically al-Qadi Iyad right there. Okay, let's see. And let's look at al-Qurtubi and let's look at this hadith. This hadith is actually key within this debate. Let's say in Sahih Muslim, that means this is an authentic hadith. Masruq said, I was inclined, it was like a reclining position with in Sayyidah Aisha's home. And then she said, Aba Aisha, 3, whoever would speak of any of them, then they had made a blasphemy upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said that is masruq. Just an idea about masruq, okay? Masruq, because I don't want you to confuse, well, who is masruq and all of that. So I'm just going to give you a little bit about masruq, okay? I'm going to go right there. Like, remember this book right there, which is Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, okay? So let's say, masruq, just give you an idea. Masruq ibn al-Ajda', which later Umar ibn Khattab said, al-Ajda' is a name that the Prophet ﷺ had forbid that anybody would name, and he called him Abd al-Rahman. Anyhow, he said, al-Imam al-Qudwa. He's the Imam. He's the example, in other words, a celebrity, somebody that we would take as a good role model. Abu Aisha al-Wadi'i. Why was he Abu Aisha? He was Abu Aisha. Masruq didn't have necessarily, a daughter named Aisha. And some scholars actually said he did. But just an idea about Masruq. Masruq was kidnapped as a child. Okay. And so later he was found. Okay. But he was still called Masruq. Masruq means kidnapped. Okay. Masruq means kidnapped or stolen. Okay. And Masruq himself, okay, was, and that's one thing, you can call that bullying, but within a society that only knew each other, sometimes not by their personal names, but they would sometimes name themselves as as their appearance or what they would know about their history, and it becomes their name. It becomes their name, that this person is called Masruq, the kidnapped one, or that one is called Dhul Yadayn, the one with the big hands, or that one is called Al-Ahnaf, the one with the bow legs. Okay, so each one would basically sometimes be labeled based on their appearance or their disability or their, I guess, exceptional ability. Okay. And at the same time, he was also called Abu Aisha. The reason why he was called Abu Aisha, most of the scholars actually said because he loved Sayyida Aisha. He was way younger than Sayyida Aisha. He was a young man. Okay, well, young boy in the beginning, of course. And then later, he would go always to learn from Sayyida Aisha. So that makes him a tabi'i. Okay, so it makes him a tabi'i, and certainly it was said, here's Abu Bakr al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, he said he was kidnapped as a young child, and then later he was found, and his father had become Muslim. Okay, and the most important people that he had learned from was Ubay ibn Ka'b, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. Okay, if proven, there's a debate whether he had met Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, but Roman and Aisha. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, was basically the most important figure that he had learned from. All right, and he was certainly one of the most important tabi'in. Who are the tabi'in? The tabi'in are basically the ones that had met the Sahaba, okay? And of course, part of the Tabi'een and his father basically had become Muslim, and he was originally from Yemen. He was also Faris. He was like a knight, a very strong, powerful person from Yemen, okay? Anyhow, I don't want to go in details with Masruq, but what was he doing? He was always learning from his Sayyidah Aisha. He was always basically referred to as the person to, in fact, be called Abu Aisha because of his dedication to learn from his Sayyidah Aisha. This is just a little bit about it. So what was he doing, just reclining in Sayyidah Aisha's home? I thought Sayyidah Aisha was not supposed to be meeting with any man. That's true. So Sayyidah Aisha would only talk to them and even teach these men behind a barrier. Behind a barrier. So that's when he says, Kuntu muttaki'an 'inda Aisha. I was reclining next to Aisha, or not next to Aisha, but in her home, that is. And then she said, "Oh, Abba Aisha, if anybody were to discuss any of them, then they had created a major blasphemy on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." And he said, "What are they?" She said, "Number one," of course, basically, that wasn't, number one was not her quote. "Whoever claimed that Muhammad ﷺ had seen his Lord had made a major blasphemy." And then he said, I was, in an inclining position, and then or reclining position, and then he sat up and he said, al-Mu'mineen, O mother of the believers, wait up on this one, and don't rush don't rush in saying this one. But didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so now he's trying to learn, he's kind of not necessarily debating her, but he's trying to, fully understand. It's like, but wait a minute, but didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say, وَلَقَدْ رَآهُ بِالْأُفُقِ الْمُبِينِ, that he had seen him in the horizon, and in another basically surah, وَلَقَدْ رَآهُ نَزْلَةً أُخْرَى, that he had seen him in a specific area. And she said, I was the first from the nation to ask this to the Prophet ﷺ. In other words, she said the same exact ayah to the Prophet ﷺ, and he responded, "This is Jibreel. إنما هو جبريل. لم أره على صورته التي خلق عليه." In other words, رآه, the pronoun who is not referring to Allah, but is referring to Jibreel. That is Jibreel. I had not seen Jibreel in his actual creation that he was created in, except 2 times. I saw him coming down from the heavens, and his basically, he would be basically covering all the sky in basically every horizon. In other words, every single space between the skies and the earth with his wings, that is. And she said, فقالت أولم تسمع أن الله عز وجل لا تدركه الأبصار. And she basically brought him, let's say, an explanation, a further explanation. She said, did you not hear that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, لا تدركه الأبصار وهو يدرك الأبصار وهو اللطيف الخبير. Basically quoted this ayah that we're doing, لا تدركه الأبصار, that the sights are not capable of encompassing the Lord Almighty, but He is capable of encompassing all, and He is the most subtle and most knowledgeable. Okay, and she said, and did you not hear وما كان لبشر أن يكلمه الله إلا وحيا أو من وراء حجاب أو يرسل رسولا فيوحي بإذنه ما يشاء إنه علي حكيم. Did you not know that this ayah, that is, and no human is capable of speaking to the Lord Almighty except through inspiration or behind a barrier, or would send a prophet to give him the inspiration with what he wills, and he is all most high and most wise. And she said, and whoever claims that the Prophet ﷺ had hidden anything from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that's basically, remember, she said 3 things, so this is the second one. Whoever claims that the Prophet ﷺ had hidden anything from the revelation, then that's a person that had created a blasphemy upon Allah. For the Lord Almighty says, O Prophet of Allah, deliver what was revealed unto you from your Lord. And if you had not delivered, then you had not delivered his message. Number 3, and she said, قالت ومن زعم أنه يخبر بما يكون في غد. Number 3, that is from me, but here she said, and whoever claimed that they would know and they have information about what would happen tomorrow, then they had created a major blasphemy on Allah. For the Lord Almighty says, قُلْ لَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ الْغَيْبَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ. No one would know what the details of what is in the heavens and the earth, or al-ghayb, or the unseen, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so you could see that Sayyidah Aisha right there had basically, one was teaching Masruq that how to understand the ayat. Notice that there's this conversation. How do we understand these ayat? How do we put these ayat together? We can't take one ayat and leave out the rest. And that she basically had questioned as well, that she was learning from the Prophet ﷺ and say, hey, I even asked the Prophet ﷺ, وَلَقَدْ رَآهُ بِالْأُفُقِ الْمُبِينِ. Wasn't that referring to Allah? I said, no, this is actually referring to Jibreel alayhi salam. وَلَقَدْ رَآهُ نَزْلَةً أُخْرَى. This is referring to Jibreel alayhi salam. Well, here's one thing. Of course, we would say, number 1 is Sayyidah Aisha, Ibn Mas'ud, Abu Huraira. They all said that was referring to Jibreel. وَلَقَدْ رَآهُ نَزْلَةً أُخْرَى وَلَقَدْ رَآهُ بِالْأُفُقِ الْمُبِينِ. Whether in Surah Al-Najm or in Surah Al-Takwir, that's referring to Jibreel alayhi salam and not to Allah Almighty. Yet, you do have, just like we said before earlier, one of the opinions for Abdullah ibn Abbas. Who's Abdullah ibn Abbas? Abdullah ibn Abbas is basically the Prophet ﷺ's cousin. When the Prophet ﷺ died, he was approximately 13 years old. And the Prophet ﷺ makes the dua for Abdullah ibn Abbas, Allahumma faqihhu fi ad-din wa'allimhu at-ta'wil. Ya Allah, give him the knowledge in the religion and give him the ability to basically interpret the religion. Interpret the religion, in other words, not only know the text, but also know how to derive from the text. Okay, let's see. According to Ibn Abbas, he said, well, the Prophet ﷺ did not say Allah with his own eyes. And he said, well, the evidence is that مَا كَذَبَ الْفُؤَادُ مَا رَأَى. the heart did not lie in what it had seen. He said, well, here it said, ما كذب الفؤاد ما رأى. And that's what he basically derived from that. And he said that there is a vision with your naked eye, and there's a vision with your heart. What's the heart? He said, al-fu'ad. Al-fu'ad is basically the root of it is basically to mean something that is the place to cook something. But this isn't talking about anything being cooked. This is actually talking about that the heart itself, that there was some warmth that it felt when he basically had seen the different details that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had shown him during the night of al-Isra and al-Mi'raj. Okay, during the night, that's why he called it al-Fu'ad, and not ما كذب القلب ما رأى. Said ما كذب الفؤاد. There was some warmth. He was feeling that warmth, seeing the different things يوم القيامة, or sorry, in his samawat, not يوم القيامة, but in his samawat during al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. Okay. Let's see. Abdullah ibn Harith, he said, we were with Ibn Abbas, and Ka'b, that is, and of course Ka'b, and he said, as for us, Banu Hashim, we would say that Muhammad had seen, that's Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, had seen his Lord twice. And then he responded and he said, why would that be something that would be impossible or astonishing? For the Lord Almighty basically had taken Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam as a companion, and Musa alayhi salam had talked to the Lord Almighty, and seeing Allah was given to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in other words, companionship and talking and seeing. And here, Ka'b basically said, Allahu Akbar, just felt that there was this relationship. And of course, حتى جاوبته الجبال. It seems like they were in an area that had mountains, and there was an echo to his takbir. Okay, so he said, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had divided seeing, talking, between Muhammad ﷺ and Musa ﷺ as well. And he talked to Musa, and Muhammad ﷺ had seen him. Okay, well, I mean, you could see the debate right there. And let's say, Abdul Razzaq, he said that Al-Hasan used to even make an oath by Allah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had seen his Lord Almighty. And that's the same thing. Abu Umar al-Talamanki. It's a strange name, isn't it? Al-Talamanki. So I basically prepared a little bit about Al-Talamanki just to see who is Al-Talamanki. Okay, it's a different name, right? Okay, let's see right there. Al-Talamanki. Again, we're doing Sir A'lam al-Nubala. Remember, this is our favorite resource, Sir A'lam al-Nubala. And let's see. Al-Talamanki, he said, he is Al-Imam al-Muqra'. Al-Imam al-Muqra'. What do you mean by al-Imam? Imam, like one of the best scholars, okay? And al-Muqra', basically the one to have the ilm in al-Quran and al-Qira'at. Al-Muhaddith, he was also a scholar that had the ilm in al-Hadith. Al-Hafidh al-Athari. And he was كان من بحور العلم. He was one of the, they used to use the word bahar. The word bahar actually means ocean or sea. But they used to, sometimes they would demonstrate something that you could be capable of visualizing. So they would call, for example, somebody that has great ilm, they'll call him bahar. That great, it's so magnificent, it's so big. Not that it really is bahar, but this is, trying to give you an idea of how vast it is. Okay, and of course, when you look at, him being basically muqra', He was a knowledgeable in the Quran. And it was said that he basically had brought to Al-Andalus lots of ilm. And he was basically a miracle in memorizing the Quran, in the way he had read, in understanding the Quran, in understanding the grammars, in understanding the different rulings in the Quran, in understanding the different ayat and the abrogated ayat. And he had written books as well about al-Quran and even about hadith. So now we would say, all of that. Let's look at Ibn Bishkwar and what he said. He said, كان سيفا مجردا على أهل الأهواء والبدع. He said he was actually like a sword that was basically right there responding and refuting all the different things that the innovators had brought. He was basically غيورا على الشريعة. He was a person that was always in defense of Sharia. He was very strong in basically in honoring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was also the one to أقرأ الناس. أقرأ الناس, it was the most to read from the Quran. And he was the most to be committed to learning hadith. And certainly, انتفع الناس بعلمه. People benefited from his ilm. And at the end, he went back to his country, and that's where he died. Okay. And basically had a dream before that he was going to die the following day. That was it. And he lived for 90 years, just a little less than 90. So we're talking about that piece of it. Let's see, hold on. So when did he die? When did al-Talamanki die? Let's see, we don't really know. Talamanki, that's what I like about Wikipedia, is that it gives me dates. Okay, 138. How do you say this? 1038? Okay. Talamanca. And Talamanca is in Barcelona, the Spain. So that's why it was called Talamanki, because of the city Talamanc. So when you go to Barcelona, Talamanki is basically there. So that's the city right there. 140 people there. Really? That's it? Okay, so let's say it's a city or a village in Barcelona in Spain. Okay, let's go back to what we were doing. So at least we know, one place I really would want to go to is basically Spain. Okay, maybe one day, inshallah. Okay, I really would want to visit there and visit Iran. I really would want to go to Iran and Morocco, Iran, and Spain. Those are the countries that I'm like, one day I'm going to go to these, okay? Because of the rich history in the Muslim presentation in Iran, and the scholars in Iran and in those areas, and also Samarkand. So Uzbekistan, I guess, included on my bucket list, inshallah. Okay, let's see. What did they say? They basically said that yes, the Prophet ﷺ had seen the Lord Almighty. But I'm going to jump a little bit. And of course, we know Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari al-Ash'ari, they basically had said that the Prophet ﷺ had seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bi basarihi, with his sight, and ayna, basically with his eyes. Well, that's the debate between Ash'ari and Ahl al-Hadith, right? And al-Hasan, basically Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, used to make that yameen, that oath, that yes, Wallahi, by Allah, the Prophet ﷺ had seen his Lord Almighty. Okay, let's see. The other debate, like we said, kind of like what we had said earlier, that is the debate is, did he see him with his naked eye? Was it with his heart? Is this something that can include salihin and pious people? Is it possible that they could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, etc.? Let's see. Abu Umar, who's Abu Umar? Abu Umar is basically Abu Umar ibn Abd al-Barr. He said, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that's basically right there, Ahl al-Hadith. They said, no, that's impossible. Oh, the Prophet ﷺ had only seen him with his heart and did not, and of course, did not see him with his eye. And Malik ibn Anas had also said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it is impossible for us to see him in dunya. Why? What's the evidence? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically eternal. And one that is eternal it is impossible for one that is not eternal, that is human beings, to basically see Allah Almighty because they would die. Okay? But in the akhirah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give them different eyes, and these eyes would become eternal, and then that's when they would be capable of seeing Allah. Al-Qadi Iyad, who's also Maliki, basically endorsed this explanation, and he said, وَهَذَا كَلَامٌ حَسَنٌ مَلِيحٌ. Said, كَلَامٌ حَسَنٌ مَلِيحٌ. It's like, this is a good explanation. And he said, and this does not have that it is impossible to see Allah, except that we would be incompetent. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give us the ability to see him, or see him basically on Judgment Day, then that would not be impossible. And that's the same thing with Prophet Musa alayhi salam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told him it would be impossible for him, لَن تَرَانِي, you would not be capable of seeing me here. Okay. وَهُوَ يُدْرِكُ الْأَبْصَارِ, and he is capable of basically encompassing everything, even though you would not have the knowledge, you would not have the competence to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all. Okay. وَهُوَ اللَّطِيفُ الْخَبِيرُ. What is al-Latif? Al-Latif has two meanings. Number one, al-Rafiq. What is al-Rafiq? Al-Rafiq is basically the one to be gentle with his servants. When you say gentle, what? Meaning not too harsh. Okay, that's a rifq. Okay, and a rifq also means at-tawfiq wal-isma. At-tawfiq, what is it, tawfiq? Tawfiq is basically giving you the success to completing and accomplishing something. Al-isma is basically to be infallible. Okay, so when you say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is rafiqun, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is latif, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that would give the support, and he would also be infallible in making a mistake. Why? Because when he is latif, he's so gentle that there's no way that this would actually go wrong. It's impossible for it to go wrong because he is latif, because he would control all the powers to make sure that this is going right. So he basically would be latif, he would be extremely gentle, and at the same time, he would basically lead to accuracy. Okay, lead to accuracy, lead to success, etc. So when we say latif, he's capable of basically knowing everything and where it is, and basically how and into what trajectory it gets into, and basically how to get it to that trajectory. But here's one thing. This is going to be the final statement right there. Okay, let's see. And he said, Junaid had said, اللطيف من نور قلبك بالهدى ورب جسمك بالغذاء وجعل لك الولاية في البلوى ويحرسك وأنت في لظى ويدخلك جنة المأوى. Allah. Junaid, what did he say? He said, Al-Latif, the subtle one, that is the Lord Almighty, is the one that had filled your heart with the light of guidance, and had given your body the food and the provision, and given you al-wilayata fil balwa, and given you the empowerment whenever you would be in a calamity, and he would guard you when you are in a dilemma, and he would bring you to the final destination of Jannah. But wait a minute, who's Junaid anyways? When you talk about Junaid, we need to learn more about Junaid, because if his words, they seem very profound, they seem very strong. We need to learn about Junaid. So let's take that moment to just learn about Junaid, and that's going to be our final thing about for today. Let's see. Junaid is Nahawandi. Nahawand, that's where? That's in Iraq. Okay. Muhammad ibn al-Junaid He was from Baghdad, and his father was Khazaz. Khazaz, in other words, he used to make silk. Okay, and he said, وَهُوَ شَيْخُ الصُّوفِيَّةِ. He was one of the Sufi sects. But here's one thing. I want you to just keep in mind, the Sufis of today are different than the Sufis of the past. Why? Many of the Sufis of the past were really dedicated to learning the deen from its resources, and at the same time, they were called many times Sufi. I mean, there's a debate why they were called Sufi, whether it's that they were, Aztecs, or whether they were wearing wool, or whether they were, learning from Ahl Sufa, basically from Ahl Sufa, going back to that. So there's that debate of why they were called Sufi. Okay, so we don't want to get into that, but he was Shaykh al-Sufiya. He was one of the main figures that basically inspired and taught the Sufis, basically, or the Sufi different groups. And later, of course, the different Sufi sects, they went into these different sects. So each one was saying, hey, with experience, we can have different ways to teaching our souls, teaching dedication, to teaching commitment. So, for example, okay, you'll have some Sufi sects, they might actually use their dhikr with movement. And they'll say, well, with our experience, we basically had seen that if you were to do the dhikr with a certain movement, that this movement would basically bring in focus. Another group would say, well, we're going to make that movement into a circle shape. Why we would get the inspiration from the different things and how they would move, whether it's a bee or probably, a certain thing that they would get the inspiration from. Another group would say, well, we're going to be adding music, or we're going to be adding this to bring in more focus, to bring in more dedication. Other groups would say, no, we're going to be using community service. The other group might say, well, no, it's about making frequent fasting, separating yourself from dunya, making frequent donations, etc., and community service. So that's another group of Sufis, etc. But of course, when you go back in history, you see that whether it's an Ahnaf ibn Qais, whether it's Junaid, whether it's the different Muhasibi, these different groups, that they were teaching more than just doing some kind of let's say, a physical training or some form of let's say, discipline, but they were also using a lot of those inspirations to learn from the Quran and Sunnah. And that's basically Junaid right there. And you could see that al-Qurtubi was also quoting on him. Let's see, Ibn al-Munadi, he said, سمع الكثير وشاهد الصالحين وأهل المعرفة ورزق الذكاء وصواب الجواب. يا سلام. So what does that mean? He said he heard a lot, meaning a lot of what? A lot of Quran, a lot of hadith, a lot of inspiration. And he had seen the Salihin. Wait a minute, why is that even important? Why so seeing the Salihin? What is that? Why is that even important? Why is that even worthy of mention? Because the more you surround yourself with Salihin, the more they would reflect on you. You surround yourself, you watch movies, for example, and let's say violence. Without you realizing, your brain is designed to replicate whatever it sees. You're going to become a violent person. You see people, you surround yourself with people that use, bad words or profanity or whatever it is. Without you realizing, your brain is going to replicate and is going to behave in that way. In the beginning, you might say, well, no, I know that's a bad word, I'm not going to say it. But without you realizing, your brain is normalizing that behavior, that it's fine. And then later on, you will start using these words, and it becomes basically your identity. So when you look at Shahada Salihin, they recognize that even if you're not part of Salihin, just by seeing a Salihin, it becomes an inspiration to you. Just see the Salihin. Even if you don't memorize the Quran, just look at them memorizing. Even if you know yourself, you're not this person that is probably understanding everything in ilm, just look at them, just watch them, just surround yourself with the salihin. Even if you are not part of the salihin, just surrounding yourself with the salihin is going to include you as part of them. وَأَهْلُ الْمَعْرِفَةِ was also part of those that had ilm. But usually al-ma'rifah is not talking about ilm as the one that you would, talk about tafsir and all of that. Al-ma'rifah is usually referred to ma'rifah, meaning knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing how to become disciplined, how to become better in your deen, committed, and all of that. And he said, and he was given his exceptional intelligence. وَصَوَابِ الْجَوَابِ. I love the way that the Arab actually say صَوَابِ الْجَوَابِ actually means the response to the answers. But you could say, he just, in just a couple of words, it contained a lot of meanings. صَوَابِ الْجَوَابِ, like the way to respond to debates or somebody that is probably objecting to him. And he said, لم يرى في زمانه مثله في عفة وعزوف عن الدنيا. We had not seen during his time, no one had seen in his bashfulness and even wanting to avoid dunya like him. So he was a person that was what? A person that was really away from he was really away from dunya and would really just wanted to basically dedicate himself. I would really want to continue talking more about Junaid. You could see him. I'm seeing quotes as I'm reading. علمنا مضبوطا علمنا مضبوط بالكتاب والسنة من لم يحفظ الكتاب ويكتب الحديث ومن لم يتفقه لا يقتدى به. He said he had taught us through the Quran and Sunnah. Whoever does not memorize the Quran, does not know the hadith, and does not learn the fiqh, that we would not take them as an example. In other words, recognize who your celebrity is. It's like, they have to have the ilm of the Quran. They have to have the ilm of the hadith. Those are the people that you would take as an example. Those are the people that you would consider as your place of barakah. Okay, I'm going to stop right here, inshallah. And, we talked about, we talked about Junaid right here. And let's go right here. Trying to get, let's see his time of death. Hold on. This is what I like going. 298 Hijriya. That's when he had died. Okay. So that's equivalent to what? So it doesn't actually. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Equivalent to 910 AD. Okay. Equivalent to 910 AD. So we talked about Junaid. We talked about Abu Umar al-Talamanki. And we talked about who else? We talked about Masruq. Talked about 3 figures today. Right? So yeah. Remember these 3, okay? Talked about Masruq, Talamanki, and Junaid. And certainly, inshallah, the day after tomorrow, not tomorrow, tomorrow's our rest day, okay? The day after tomorrow, we'll continue with our tafsir. قَدْ جَاءَكُمْ بَصَائِرُ مِنْ رَبِّكُمْ وَمَنْ أَبْصَرَ فَلِنَفْسِهِ وَمَنْ عَمِيَ فَعَلَيْهَا وَمَا أَنَا عَلَيْكُمْ بِحَفِيظٍ. Any questions before we end? No one has any questions? All right. What I'm